The battlefield in Ukraine has now literally turned into a place of fire. While the Russians expected an attack from the Bakhmut soldier Marine Corps Kaliska directions in the Donetsk region, the Ukrainians blockaded the Zaporizhia region. Currently, the Ukrainian armed forces have advanced about 1,400 meters on the northern and southern flanks of Bakhmut a few days ago. But recently, the Ukrainians have turned their offensive access from Donetsk to Zaporizhia. The Ukrainian army carried out an offensive operation in this region that will go down in the history of world wars. Western battle tanks and armored vehicles were used for the first time by the Ukrainians in critical offensive operations in this region. Russian forces were caught off guard in the region south of Zaporizhia overnight in an all-out Ukrainian counterattack involving 150 armored vehicles and thousands of elite Ukrainian soldiers. These war vehicles included dozens of German-made Leopard 2 main battle tanks and US-made Bradley M2A2 light tanks. The Russian Ministry of Defense reported that they repulsed the attacks of this huge Ukrainian tank battalion south of Zaporizhia. But the active offensive of the Ukrainian forces in this area was in full swing. Currently, clashes have been going on for about a week in the Zaporizhia region. But for the first time in a long time, the southern flanks of the region began to be this active. In addition to the military contingent of Bradley and Leopard combat vehicles, the Ukrainians sent their special forces to the southern flanks of the Zaporizhia region. Ukrainian special forces conducted an incredible offensive operation against the Russians here. Russian media reported that Ukraine launched a massive tank attack in the direction of Zaporizhia, and there were many seriously wounded soldiers on the battlefield. In addition, soldiers of the 65th Mechanized Brigade, 23rd Public Protection Brigade, 15th Operation Brigade, Kharkiv National Guard, 110th Defense Brigade, and 102nd Defense Brigade took part in this offensive operation of the Ukrainian army. These Ukrainian special forces first broke through the first Russian border line in Orikhiv. Then the 5 special Ukrainian forces dispersed to the east and west of Orikhiv from 2 branches and started to advance in these areas. In addition to these special forces, the Ukrainian Tank Battalion, including Bradley and Leopard 2s, supported the offensive operations in the same region. This tank battalion went ahead to clear the course of the Ukrainian Special Forces, providing a safe line of sight and route to the Ukrainian Guards. The Guards of the 15th Operation Brigade, Kharkiv National Guard, the 65th Mechanized Brigade, and the 23rd Public Protection Brigade broke through the Russian trench and defense line from the west of Orikhiv to Vasilivka, where they made serious progress. On the other hand, the soldiers of the 110th Defense Brigade and the 102nd Defense Brigade of the Ukrainian Army advanced from the eastern flanks of Orikhiv to Poloi. This mind-blowing war tactic was one of the most effective methods used by the Ukrainians in the Zaporizhia region to date. Therefore, the Russian troops had to retreat from the front lines of Vasilivka and Poloi, where the Ukrainian special forces attacked in order not to inflict too many casualties, and Russian forces failed to register any retaliatory attacks in either area. Because the Ukrainian army has deployed its 5 special units in a way that will completely blockade both Vasilivka and Poloi. Here, the search and reconnaissance operations of the Ukrainians still continue. The aim is to destroy the remaining Russian troops and continue the advance. Russian sources also admit that the Ukrainian army has begun a counterattack. The latest geolocation footage proved that Ukrainian forces in western Zaporizhia Oblast made local gains during counterattacks southwest and southeast of Orikhiv. We think that the Russians had their first defeat against the Western tanks in the inventory of the Ukrainian army. Russian leader Vladimir Putin was against the sending of these tanks to the Ukrainian army at the time. Putin's concerns were not unfounded because the Ukrainian forces carried out another offensive operation to crown their victory in the Zaporizhia region after the events in Orikhiv. It was claimed that the Russian reinforcements from the direction of Kamyanka-Dniprovsk advanced over the city of Zapovednik to support Orikhiv. However, the Kamyanka-Dniprovsk direction where the Russian reinforcements wanted to advance was a risky front line, where the counterattack actions of the Ukrainian army were very intense. A convoy of military vehicles from the 83rd Brigade of the Russian Air Force took all the risks due to the critical situation in Orikhiv and proceeded on its route towards the Zaporizhia region to reach Orikhiv via Zapovednik. In this critical area, the White Wolves, one of the most special units of the Ukrainian army, managed to stop the convoy of the 83rd Brigade of the Russian Air Force near the Zapovednik settlement. After fierce clashes, this Russian convoy was almost destroyed by the Ukrainian special team, the White Wolves. Russian weapons in the convoy were completely destroyed. After these successful attacks by the White Wolves special units of the Ukrainian army, the Russian military convoy could not reach Orikhiv. Therefore, a critical front line in the northeast of Orikhiv also lacked the military support of the Russian army. Realizing this situation, the special units of the Ukrainian army and the tank battalion consisting of the German Leopard 2 and M1 Bradley fighting vehicle took action. At the same time, when Ukrainian special forces called the White Wolves stopped the Russian military convoy in Zapovednik, the Ukrainians were conducting an incredible offensive operation in Storazev, southwest of Velika Novosilka. At this point, the Ukrainian Army's US-made Bradley fighting vehicle and German-made Leopard 2 tanks were on the scene again in Storazev. The soldiers of Russia's 60th Motor Brigade were trying to resist critical attacks by the 108th Defense Brigade and 128th Regional Defense Brigade of the Ukrainian Army. At the same time, Ukraine's tank battalion was supporting these critical operations with its effective firing and incredible maneuvers. So the Russian troops are well cornered. In addition, when Ukraine's 68th Jaeger Brigade, which came to support from the northeast lines of Storazev, came to support the offensive operations in this city, things started to change. Parallel to the route where the 68th Jaeger Brigade of the Ukrainian Army came, that is east of Storazev, the 37th Motorized Brigade of the Russian Army was located. However, against 3 special forces from the Ukrainian Army, the Russian Army was able to send only 2 military special forces to the city of Storazev. In addition, the Ukrainians' Leopard 2 tanks and Bradley fighting vehicle limited the Russians' mobility in this area. The fierce artillery fire from the German Leopard 2 and the constant dispatch of the M1 Bradley fighting vehicle to the front were literally dragging the Russians into a swamp here. The numerical superiority was on the Ukrainian side. Therefore, Ukrainian special forces were able to blockade Storazev from the north and northeast directions. After several hours of clashes, Ukrainian special forces managed to completely repulse the Russians in Storazev and captured this city. Finally, the great offensive operations of the Ukrainian armed forces achieved a critical success and liberated this occupied city from the Russians. In other words, when we consider all these details, the capture of Storazev by the Ukrainian army will act as a bridge between Donetsk and Zaporizhia for the great offensive plans of Kiev. On the other hand, the offensive operations here can be counted as the second victory of the German Leopard 2 tanks and the US-made Bradley fighting vehicle, because these vehicles provided significant support to the Ukrainian special forces, and they were able to clear the clash area in both attack operations. The Ukrainians placed the battleships Leopard 2 and Bradley so strategically in the Zaporizhia region that Russia had little they could do. In summary, Western and US-made battleships are of vital importance for the Ukrainian army. On the other hand, the USA realized that this situation gave Ukraine an advantage and recently announced a brand new military support package. The United States has announced that it will provide an additional $1.2 billion in military aid to Ukraine. The new aid package for Ukraine includes air defense systems and conventional drone ammunition. Thanks to this announced package, Ukraine will also have the technology that will allow the integration of Western air defense launchers, missiles, and radar with Ukraine's domestic air defense systems. Following the battleships, Washington supports Kiev's advance in airspace. Considering all these events, victory seems very close for the Ukrainians. Ukraine's counterattack continues unabated. Kiev armed forces are conducting offensive operations in many regions. The most violent clashes of the war are experienced in the eastern and southern axes. Ukrainian forces announced that they had recaptured a village in the Russian-occupied Donetsk region. The Russian governor was quick to deny Kiev's statements. According to military information from Kiev, Ukrainian soldiers liberated the town of Ladny in the largely Russian-occupied Donetsk region. The village is about 40 kilometers southwest of the region's capital, Donetsk, not far from the railway line to the port city of Mariupol. Soldiers released a video showing the Ukrainian flag hoisted over half-destroyed building. It was reported that the detainees were also taken away. In addition, the Days are very active in Bakhmut. The castle of the East Ukraine is making critical gains in Bakhmut, where both sides do not give up fighting and host the most striking moments of the war. In recent days, the Ukrainian armed forces have made critical gains in this fortress city on the Bakhmut axis. The Ukrainian army advanced up to 1,400 meters in different areas during the past day. Ukraine had previously been fighting Wagner troops on this front line. Now there are clashes with the motorized rifle and airborne troops of the Russian Federation. Colonel Serhiy Sharavathy, spokesman of the Eastern Operation Command, stated that the Ukrainian army launched attacks on Russian positions in counterattack. Sharavathy emphasized that the Russians are in rotation and take advantage of the fact that they are displaced by advanced units. Caravaggio stated that his forces were moving on a train where they would be in more favorable positions than Russian troops. According to him, the Ukrainian armed forces have already captured several hills. The advance of Ukrainian troops in Bakhmut has been going on for a week now. Kiev forces managed to advance a total of 7 kilometers at Bakhmut. On the other hand, as the Ukrainian armed forces continued to advance in Bakhmut, they were also launching attacks on critical points for Russian troops. The past day, the Ukrainian armed forces destroyed a weapons and ammunition depot belonging to the Russian troops in the direction of Bakhmut. Images of the attack were shared on social media platforms, as can be seen from the video footage. The attack took place in the wooded areas of Bakhmut. The ammunition depot is surrounded by trees, could not escape being the target of the Ukrainian artillery with successful artillery fire. The Russian ammunition depot was blown up. It is a matter of curiosity how the Moscow army, which has been struggling with the lack of ammunition for a long time, will fight this latest loss. Russian troops are struggling to continue their offensive despite casualties during the past day. Russian troops opened fire on Ukrainian positions 368 times with artillery fire. There were 15 clashes in 5 airstrikes between the two sides. The Ukrainian defense forces managed to eliminate 120 Russian soldiers. 163 were wounded and 11 captured. In addition, 3 guns are known artillery system, a Gvozdika self-propelled artillery system, a Rapier anti-tank gun, a Grad, multiple rocket launcher, and 3 field ammunition depots were also destroyed as a result of the clashes. The Ukrainian defense forces eliminated about 213,770 Russian soldiers last day, including 1010. Now let's turn our direction to the west of Ukraine. They released a video showing the Ukrainian 130th Brigade attacking Leopard and successfully capturing the settlement. The video shows the main assault group advancing along the tree arches and preparing to enter the settlement using small mortars. Ukrainian forces are able to make rapid attacks on regular Russian defenses and suppress Russian fire. The Ukrainian armed forces were ready to enter the side streets of the settlement after a 5-minute effort. Russian sources said that Ukrainian troops began digging trenches south of the village and preparing fortifications near Pitskati when the Russian troops once again began the artillery bombardment. The Ukrainian forces claimed that they had left the village without fighting. Some sources claimed that only one XBT arrived in the village, brought in reinforcements, and took the wounded and left the village. The most recent reports indicate that the Russians engaged in clashes with some Ukrainian assault units near Bianchi. But the details of these conflicts are not yet known. Coming to the main offensive direction, there is a situation that we must first mention. The last day, Ukrainian sources stated that the battalion and brigade commanders had a meeting with the top generals. They developed solutions for the problems experienced in the first days, and all plans were rearranged. One of the low-ranking commanders stated that some mistakes are inevitable because it is impossible to predict everything on paper. According to the Ukrainian commander, the engineers started to carry out their reconnaissance with a different approach, and the problem created by the Russian mines is already starting to get smaller. Ukrainian forces were widely criticized for not using demining devices, but the Russians did not include the demining devices of the Ukrainian forces in the images they first published. They did this to make the Ukrainian forces look bad. In the current images, it is seen that the Ukrainian forces came prepared and brought the mine clearance tools. Ukrainian troops also confirmed that they had successfully evacuated the Leopard tanks, with most of them only receiving minor damage. Some tanks were made ready for use after changing wheels and tracks. Kiev forces were able to evacuate these vehicles because after the battle 2 days ago, the front line shifted south for 3 kilometers. In the past 3 days, Russian sources state that the Ukrainian forces have captured some positions, but the attacks were repelled and these positions were taken back. However, when we look at the maps published by the Russians, we see that the front line has visibly shifted to the south for 3 days. Ukrainian forces have advanced up to 3 kilometers in a 16-kilometer wide line. This information is also in line with reports that Ukrainian troops approached Robertson and captured the tactical hills. Because when we look at the topographic map, we realize that the Ukrainian troops captured the hills, and even the Russian maps show this. The reports that some Ukrainian soldiers were able to see the main Russian strongholds directly are also in line with this information. Even recently, a Russian commander evaluated Russian tactics. According to the Russian commander, the purpose of the first line of defense is to exhaust the Ukrainian offensive units. If the attack is too severe, the Russian troops retreat to the second line of defense. When the Ukrainian offensive units exhaust their offensive capabilities, the Russian reserves are activated, according to the commander's claims. All positions are being taken back by attacking the exhausted Ukrainian forces. It looks like the second part of the plan hasn't worked for now. One of the reasons this didn't work was that after the attacks, Ukrainian troops mined the roads through the Russian reserves using random artillery shells, a remote anti-tank mine deployment system. RAM is a special type of artillery shell capable of firing anti-tank mines up to 17 kilometers away. Russian sources stated that the Ukrainian troops mined all the roads between Robertson and Verbov, and that the Ukrainian soldiers are trying to move in this direction. Last night, Russian sources stated that the Ukrainian forces had launched an artillery bombardment and therefore expected a new attack. Russian sources complained that Ukrainian forces have switched to night attacks because the Ukrainian armed forces can do a much better job in night attacks thanks to the superior thermal cameras of Western weapons systems. Rogozin, the head of an agency dealing with the control of Russian weapons and supplies, said he disagreed with the emerging rumors that the Ukrainian forces had been defeated. Counter-offensive operations seem to be moving in Ukraine's favor. Kiev troops equipped with Western equipment make the work of the Russian army very difficult on the front lines against Ukraine's Western-backed army. Russia has an army that has been shaken by casualties and has largely lost its capabilities. In such a case, the performance of the Russian army on the front lines will not be at the desired level. The performance of the Moscow troops in the coming days will paint a clearer picture of the course of the war. Historical moments continue to be experienced in Bakhmut, the stronghold of the war between Ukraine and Russia. Russian leader Vladimir Putin is using the soldiers of the Chechen leader Kadyrov and the mercenaries of the Wagner Group, as well as the Russian regular army, to capture the city. But Putin is pushing both additional military resources to the front of the front lines, often found on the battlefield in Ukraine. Wagner and Kadyrov soldiers, known as suicide squads, are experiencing the most military losses in their history during the clashes in Ukraine. But this does not affect Vladimir Putin much. The interesting thing is that Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu doesn't speak much about this situation. Prigozhin had threatened the Kremlin with the withdrawal of his troops a few days ago, but Wagner leader Prigozhin, who did not want to keep his silence on this matter any longer, announced that his fighters would leave the city of Bakhmut in eastern Ukraine on May 10th due to the shortage of ammunition. Prigozhin turns his back on Putin with this rebellion. Yes, you heard right. Prigozhin, one of the closest friends of Russian leader Vladimir Putin, will gather his mercenaries and leave Bakhmut. This striking news became the focus of the war agenda for the first time since the beginning of the war. Russian leader Putin must have felt so alone because at the moment the Russian army is having serious problems in finding soldiers to take to the front lines. Let's take a closer look at the reasons for Prigozhin's critical decision and its possible future effects. In a message published in the press service of Prigozhin's company, Concord, Prigozhin addressed Russian President Vladimir Putin, Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu, and Chief of Staff Valery Gerasimov. The Wagner leader released a heated video targeting Russian Defense Minister Shoigu and Russian Chief of Staff Gerasimov, blaming them and their inability to provide more ammunition for the deaths of their fighters. The 61-year-old Prigozhin recently attributed the decision to withdraw from Bakhmut directly to the Russian Defense Ministry in a slang statement. Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu and Chief of Staff Valery Gerasimov have been the focus of Prigozhin's anger amid reports of violent infighting between different power groups and Russian President Vladimir Putin's entourage. In the statement, Prigozhin emphasized that Wagner's losses were increasing exponentially every day due to the lack of ammunition. That's why the Wagner leader no longer wants to stay in Bakhmut. However, the Wagner leader announced that his fighters would remain in their positions until May 9th, when Russia celebrated Victory Day in the Second World War, and that they would withdraw from Bakhmut only the next day. The Wagner leader noted that this time frame is quite remarkable, as Russia celebrates its annual Victory Day on May 9th to commemorate the defeat of the Nazis in World War II, because the Ukrainian armed forces had given messages and hints that they would organize a surprise attack operation in this time period. On the other hand, in the previously published video, Prigozhin, who stood in front of his men, announced that he would hand over the positions in Bakhmut settlement to the Defense Ministry unit. He also announced that he would withdraw the remnants of this paramilitary unit to logistics camps in order to heal the wounds of the Wagner group. The Wagner leader may be chasing a commercial, but the impact of these ads has apparently waned in recent months. The Wagner leader made threats he had not fulfilled before. Then Prigozhin dismissed them as jokes and military humor. But these last statements by Yevgeny Prigozhin may be serious. Just last week, the Wagner leader told a pro-war Russian blogger that the Wagner fighters in Bakhmut were in their last days of stockpiling, and they needed thousands of shells. Additionally, Prigozhin stated that the amount of ammunition of the Ukrainian forces was 5 times more than that of his own mercenary group, pointing out that the Russians could not actually take Bakhmut, stating that he expected criticism of the decision to withdraw from Bakhmut. Prigozhin called on those who condemned the withdrawal decision to come to the city and stand with weapons in their hands instead of their murdered comrades. However, Ukraine's Ministry of Defense announced that contrary to the Wagner leader's statements, it did not see any decrease in the intensity of clashes near Bakhmut. Speaking on the subject, Sergei Sharavathy, spokesman for the Eastern Command of Ukraine, claimed that Prigozhin had been trying to make ugly statements to attract attention for months. Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov also made striking statements on the issue. Peskov noted that he saw Prigozhin's statement but could not comment on it, since it supposedly relates to the course of the special military operation. A spaced military analyst Robley argues that Wagner's latest complaint about the shortages likely reflects Russia's defense minister rationing ammunition ahead of Ukraine's long-awaited counterattack. The Russian ministry has to defend the entire front, but Prigozhin's only concern is to get Bakhmut. The situation seriously harms Russia. It is clear that Prigozhin can claim political praise if Wagner succeeds in capturing the city. On the other hand, Prigozhin suggested that the Wagner group must acquire Bakhmut by May 9, 2023. Otherwise, his decision will be realized. In this regard, critical statements by Ukraine were not delayed. Ukraine's Deputy Defense Minister, Hanna Maliar, stated that Russia desperately tried to capture Bakhmut by May 9th, but it was very difficult. The mercenary chief predicted that the Ukrainian counteroffensive would begin on May 15th, with tanks and artillery able to advance in dry air after the last spring rain. Because of these estimates, the Wagner leader may have given a specific date, such as May 9th. In a separate move, Prigozhin appears to have recruited an army general who was recently dismissed as chief of logistics. This person is Colonel Mikhail Mazaintsov himself. Colonel Mazaintsov was referred to as the Butcher of Mariupol for his role in last year's bombing of the port city in southern Ukraine, which was captured by Russian forces a year ago. Prigozhin pointed out that the general did his best to provide ammunition to the mercenaries, and the Wagner leader also stressed that Colonel Minets, if cooperated with the mercenary group's efforts to recruit convicted prisoners. Colonel Mazaintsov announced last September that Prigozhin would be released from prison if he served inmates in a Russian prison with his men in Ukraine. So how did this mercenary group come about, and when did Prigozhin come to a position to turn his back on Putin? Prigozhin acted as a key player in Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, launched in February 2022, responsible for a private army of mercenaries leading the Russian offensive. Yevgeny Prigozhin recruited thousands of convicted criminals from prison for his group, no matter how serious their crimes, as long as they agreed to fight for Wagner in Ukraine. Prigozhin hails from St. Petersburg, the hometown of Russian President Vladimir Putin. The Russian leader and Wagner boss most likely first met in one of Prigozhin's restaurants in the city. Years later, Prigozhin's catering company Concord signed a contract to supply the Kremlin with food, earning him the nickname Putin's chief. Now, Wagner leader Yevgeny Prigozhin has disrupted the system of the Russian army and managed to penetrate the cells of critical institutions such as the Moscow administration and the Russian Ministry of Defense. In summary, in the following period, Russian leader Vladimir Putin may face serious negativity due to these decisions of Prigozhin.